Before the story begins, the Appalachian dossier is out. 7 of untold cases, the research, the evidence, the truth they buried. Link in the description. Support the channel. Now, let's go in. You ever get that feeling when you wake up and something's just off? Not wrong exactly, but like the world shifted an inch to the left while you were sleeping? Like the air tastes different or the shadows fall at angles they shouldn't? Before we start, tell me, where are you listening from right now? Drop it in the comments. I love knowing where our listeners are tuning in from, whether you're in some quiet apartment or maybe driving down a dark road somewhere. Wherever you are, get comfortable. Pull up a chair. Turn down the lights if you want. This one's going to take a while, and I promise you, by the end of it, you're going to be looking over your shoulder. The year was 1887, and in the mountains of western Virginia, there was a town that doesn't exist anymore. Not on any map you'll find today, anyway. It was called Ashmont Ridge, tucked so deep into those Appalachian hollows that even the mail came only twice a month, and that was when the weather cooperated. The ridge itself was a long, serpentine stretch of rock and pine that ran for maybe 12 miles, and the town, if you could call it that, was really just a scattering of buildings along a muddy main street that turned to soup every time it rained. There was a general store with a false front that made it look bigger than it was, a church with a steeple that leaned slightly to the east, like it was trying to hear something in the distance, a boarding house that smelled of boiled cabbage and lamp oil, and at the far end, past where the road turned to little more than wagon ruts and the trees pressed in close enough to scrape your shoulders if you weren't careful, there was a house that everyone called the Hollings place. Martha Hollings was 34 years old in the autumn of 1887. She was a tall woman, maybe 5'9", which was unusual for the time, the kind of height that made men uncomfortable and other women whisper. She had dark hair that she kept pinned tight against her skull in a bun so severe it looked painful, and eyes the color of slate just before a storm. Her hands were always busy, always moving. If you saw her in town, which wasn't often, she'd be carrying something, fixing something, her long fingers moving with that kind of precision that comes from a lifetime of work where mistakes cost you money you don't have. She'd been a seamstress before she married, one of the best in 3 counties, people said. They said she could look at a piece of fabric, just run her fingers over it once, and see the finished garment like it was already there, just waiting for her to pull it out of the cloth. She'd married a man named Roland Hollings when she was 22. Roland had been a logger, one of those broad-shouldered, quiet men who could fell a tree in the time it took most men to sharpen their axe. He had hands like slabs of granite and a voice so deep you felt it in your chest when he spoke, which wasn't often. They'd built that house together, him cutting the timber from the very ridge they lived on, her planning every room down to where the window should face to catch the morning light. It was a good house, solid, 2 stories, painted white, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and eastern side. Inside, everything was ordered, clean, the kind of place where you'd wipe your boots twice before stepping in, and even then you'd feel like you were tracking in the whole forest. But Roland had died 4 years before our story begins. Logging accident, a widowmaker, they called it, a dead branch high up in a tree, 40 feet maybe, that had been hanging there waiting for God knows how long. It came down without warning while Roland was working below, caught him across the back of the skull with enough force to crack bone, and he was gone before he hit the ground. They said he probably didn't feel anything. They said that to Martha like it was supposed to be a comfort. She buried him in the small cemetery behind the church under a simple granite stone that read his name, the years he lived, and nothing else. No beloved husband, no loving father, because they'd never had children. Just his name and the dates, like a ledger entry. After that, she lived alone. Now, living alone in 1887 wasn't unusual for a widow, but living alone in a house that size, that far from the center of town, that close to the deep woods where the loggers wouldn't even go after dark, people talked. They said it wasn't proper. They said a woman couldn't manage. They said she should sell the place, move into town, take a room at the boarding house, find work as a cook or laundress, something suitable. But Martha managed just fine. She kept a garden that produced more vegetables than she could eat, and she'd trade the surplus for flour and sugar and lamp oil. She kept chickens that laid enough eggs to see her through the week. She took in sewing work when she needed actual money, and the rest of the time she kept to herself. People respected that mostly, or at least they left her alone, which amounted to the same thing. The trouble started in October. It was the kind of October where the air turns sharp enough to cut, where you can see your breath in the mornings, and the leaves go from green to red to brown in what feels like a single afternoon. The kind of October where the light gets thin and pale, like it's being stretched too far, and the shadows start reaching earlier and earlier each day. The town had been quiet that fall. Harvest was mostly done, and people were starting to think about winter, about stocking cellars and splitting wood and making sure the roof wasn't going to cave in under the first heavy snow. There was a rhythm to it, a predictability that people found comforting. Martha had been in town earlier that week, the third week of October, picking up thread from the general store. She needed black thread for a mourning dress she was altering for Clara Jennings, whose husband had died the previous spring. The owner of the store, a man named Silas Pembroke, who'd run the place for 20 years and knew everyone's business whether they told him or not, had mentioned to her that there'd been some odd things happening around town. Nothing serious, he'd said, just strange. Tools going missing from Abe Mortimer's shed. A fence post pulled clean out of the ground over at the Hendricks farm, not broken, not cut, just pulled up like someone had yanked it out with their bare hands. Strange sounds at night that folks couldn't quite place. Animals acting skittish. Martha had listened politely while Silas rang up her purchase, his wire-rimmed spectacles sliding down his nose like they always did, paid for her thread with coins she counted out carefully, and left. She didn't put much stock in gossip. Towns like Ashmont Ridge ran on gossip the way mills ran on water, and most of it was just people finding patterns in randomness, because the alternative was admitting that sometimes things just happened. But 3 nights later, she heard it herself. She'd been in bed, the kind of deep sleep you only get when you're bone-tired from a day's work. She'd spent the afternoon repairing a tear in her winter coat, and then digging up the last of the potatoes before the ground froze, and by the time she'd washed and eaten a cold supper, she could barely keep her eyes open. The sound woke her sometime after midnight. She knew it was after midnight because the moon had moved across the sky enough that it was no longer shining through her bedroom window, and the room was pitch black, except for the faint glow of banked coals in the fireplace downstairs. The sound was a scraping, metal on wood, slow, deliberate. It wasn't the random scratch of a branch against the side of the house, which she was used to. This was rhythmic, purposeful. It was coming from somewhere outside, maybe near the back of the house where the kitchen was. She lay there in the dark, her heart starting to pick up speed, listening. The scraping stopped. Then it started again, same rhythm, same deliberate pace. Stopped. Started. Like someone dragging a blade or a piece of metal along the side of the house, taking their time. Martha got up. She didn't light a candle, didn't want to make herself a target if someone was actually out there. She went to the window in her bare feet, the floorboards cold enough to make her toes curl, and looked out. The moon was 3/4 full, bright enough that she could see the yard clearly. The chicken coop sat silent, the birds inside presumably asleep. The garden looked untouched, the rows of turned earth where the potatoes had been dark against the grass. The well stood like a sentinel near the side of the house. Nothing moved, no shadows that shouldn't be there, no figure lurking. She stood there for a long time, maybe 10 minutes, watching and listening. The scraping didn't come back. But she didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, she checked the exterior of the house. She walked the perimeter slowly, looking at every board, every join. On the back wall, near the corner where the kitchen addition met the original structure, she found marks. Fresh gouges in the wood, running horizontal for maybe 2 feet. They were deep, maybe 1/8 of an inch, cut clean into the paint and the wood beneath. Whatever made them had taken real force. She ran her fingers along the grooves. They were smooth inside, not ragged like an animal's claws would make. More like something metal had been dragged along the surface with considerable pressure. She stood there in the cold morning air, her breath steaming, looking at those marks and trying to think of an explanation that made sense. A falling branch? No, the marks were too regular, too horizontal. An animal? What kind of animal would do this? A prank? Maybe. But who would come all the way out here in the middle of the night just to scratch at her house? She didn't have an answer. That same week, Abe Mortimer reported that 3 of his sheep had gone missing, just vanished from the pen overnight. The gate was still latched. The fence was intact. No tracks in the mud around the enclosure, no blood, no wool caught on splinters, nothing. 15 years he'd been raising sheep, Abe said, and he'd never seen anything like it. Wolves he could understand, bears, coyotes, even wild dogs. He knew how to deal with those. But this, it was like the sheep had just ceased to exist. Then there was the incident at the church. Reverend Josiah Blackwood, a man in his middle 50s, with a voice like gravel tumbling in a barrel and a habit of pausing mid-sentence to peer over his spectacles at whoever he was talking to, had gone to the church early one Sunday morning to prepare for services. It was his routine. He'd arrive an hour before anyone else, light the lamps, review his sermon notes, make sure the hymnals were properly distributed along the pews. When he unlocked the heavy oak door that Sunday and stepped inside, he found that every single pew in the church had been turned to face the back wall, not moved aside, not pushed together, turned, rotated. Each one positioned precisely, parallel to each other, all facing away from the pulpit, away from the altar, toward the blank wall at the back where the door was. He stood in the doorway, one hand still on the door handle, staring. The church had 20 pews, 10 on each side of the center aisle. Each one was solid oak, heavy enough that it took 2 strong men to move one. Turning all of them must have taken hours. And the church had been locked. He'd locked it himself the previous evening after prayer meeting, had the only key on a ring in his pocket. He didn't tell anyone at first. He spent that hour before services turning them all back, sweating through his shirt despite the cold, his hands shaking. But word got out anyway. Small towns don't keep secrets. Someone saw him through the window, or maybe he told his wife and she told someone, or maybe the story just manifested itself out of the air the way stories do in places where not much happens. By the following Wednesday, everyone knew. And now, let me ask you something. You ever had one of those moments where you just knew something was about to go wrong? Not anxiety, not worry, but a bone-deep certainty that something bad was coming? Leave a comment about a time you had a feeling like that. I want to hear your stories because I think we all know that feeling. That prickle at the back of your neck, that tightness in your chest, your body knowing something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. Martha started noticing things around her property. Small things at first. Her clothesline had been cut. Not untied, not pulled down, but cut clean through with something sharp. She found it one morning lying in the grass, the rope severed in the middle, her sheets and shirt scattered in the dew. A bucket she left on the porch, a wooden bucket she used for hauling water from the well, was found 3 days later, 100 yards into the woods, sitting upright on a tree stump like someone had carefully placed it there. Her garden gate, which she always latched at night to keep deer out, was open 3 mornings in a row, not broken, not torn off its hinges, just unlatched and swinging open. She began sleeping lighter. Every sound the house made, every creak of settling wood, every gust of wind had her eyes snapping open in the dark. She kept Roland's old skinning knife under her pillow, the blade still sharp, the handle worn smooth from years of use. During the day she worked. She had to work. Bills didn't stop because you were scared. At night, she sat in her kitchen with a lamp burning low and listened to the house and the woods beyond. One evening in late October, just before the month turned, there was a knock at her door. It was just after sunset. The sky had gone from orange to purple to that deep blue that comes right before true dark, and the first stars were starting to show through the gaps in the clouds. Martha had been mending a dress by lamplight, one of her own dresses that had torn at the seam, her needle moving in and out in the rhythmic way that let her mind wander. When the knock came, 3 sharp raps against the wood, her needle stopped mid-stitch. She wasn't expecting anyone. People didn't visit unannounced, especially not after dark, especially not out here. She set the dress aside and stood, her heart already starting to race. The knock came again. Same rhythm, 3 raps, evenly spaced, deliberate. She went to the door but didn't open it, didn't even put her hand on the handle. "Who's there?" No answer, just silence on the other side of the door. She could see the gap at the bottom, could see that there was no light outside, no lantern. Whoever was out there was standing in the dark. She waited. Another knock, same rhythm, 3 raps, calm, patient. I said, "Who's there?" Still nothing, not a word, not a sound. She put her hand on the door handle, felt the cold metal against her palm. Part of her wanted to open it, needed to know who or what was on the other side. Part of her knew with absolute certainty that opening that door would be a mistake she wouldn't recover from. She stood there for a long time, her hand on the handle, listening. The silence stretched. A minute, 2, 5. Finally, she couldn't stand it any more. She yanked the door open, stepping back as she did, ready to run or fight or scream. The porch was empty. No one there, no figure retreating down the road, no sound of footsteps. Nothing. She stepped out onto the porch, looked left, looked right. The road was dark. The trees were still. She walked to the edge of the porch, her bare feet silent on the wood, and called out into the night. "If this is some kind of joke, it's not funny. You hear me?" Her voice carried out into the darkness and died. No echo, no response. Just the sound of the wind in the trees and, far off, an owl calling. She went back inside, locked the door, pushed a chair against it, and sat there until dawn. The next day, she went into town. She needed to talk to someone, and Silas Pembroke had always been decent to her, had never asked questions about why she chose to live the way she did. She found him behind the counter of the general store, tallying up receipts with a pencil that he kept licking the tip of. "Silas, you got a minute?" He looked up, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, and nodded. "For you, Martha." "Course. What's on your mind?" She told him. About the knocking, about the marks on the house, the bucket in the woods, the clothesline. She didn't mention the scraping sound, didn't want to sound hysterical. Small-town women had to be careful about that. Show too much fear, too much emotion, and people started making assumptions about your mental state. Silas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he leaned back against the wall behind him and crossed his arms over his chest, his apron smudged with flour from the morning's deliveries. "You're not the only one," he said quietly. He told her that 4 other households had reported similar things in the past 2 weeks. Unexplained noises, objects moved or missing, livestock disturbed or vanished. One woman, Clara Jennings, the same one Martha was altering the morning dress for, claimed she'd seen a figure standing at the edge of her property 3 nights in a row. Always in the same spot, she said, at the tree line about 50 yards from her house, always facing her house. She'd called out to it the first night, thinking it might be someone who needed help. It didn't move, didn't respond. The second night, she'd taken her late husband's rifle, a heavy Springfield that kicked like a mule, and fired a shot into the air. A warning. The figure didn't move. The third night, when she'd gone inside to fetch the rifle again, it was gone by the time she came back out. Martha felt something tighten in her chest. A cold, creeping sensation that started in her stomach and spread outward. "What do you think it is?" she asked. Silas shook his head slowly. "Don't know, Martha. I truly don't. Some folks are saying it's drifters. Someone passing through causing trouble. Sheriff's been asking around, but he hasn't found anything. No strangers in town. No one's seen anyone they don't recognize." "And what do you think?" He hesitated. She could see him weighing his words, trying to decide how much to say. Finally he said, "I think there's things in these mountains we don't understand. Always have been. My grandfather used to tell stories about them. Old stories, things that lived here before we did." Martha left the store with more thread than she needed, and a feeling she couldn't shake, like ice water in her veins. That night, she didn't sleep at all. She sat in her kitchen with a lamp burning low and Roland's hunting rifle across her lap. She'd loaded it earlier that evening, though she hadn't fired a gun in years, not since Roland had tried to teach her, and she'd nearly blown a hole in the barn roof. The rifle was heavy, solid, the wood stock smooth under her hands. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel in the front room, each tick loud enough to make her flinch. At 2:30 in the morning, she heard footsteps on the porch. They were slow, measured, deliberate. The boards creaked under weight. That particular creak, the third board from the left made, the one Roland had always meant to fix, but never got around to. She stood, gripping the rifle so hard her knuckles went white. The footsteps moved from the front of the house toward the side, toward the kitchen window where she was standing. Then they stopped. She waited, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps that she tried to quiet. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her ears, drowning out everything else. Then the scraping started again. This time it was louder, more aggressive. It sounded like someone was dragging a metal rod along the side of the house, running it over every board, every joint, with enough force that she could feel the vibration through the walls. It moved from the corner toward the front, toward the door. Each scrape was deliberate, spaced out, almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat or a countdown. Martha raised the rifle, aimed it at the door, her hands shaking so badly she could barely keep it level. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Then the door handle rattled. Someone was trying to get in. The handle turned one way, then the other, the metal scraping against metal. She could hear breathing on the other side of the door now, slow, rasping breaths that didn't sound quite right, like air being forced through something that wasn't meant to breathe. She wanted to call out, wanted to demand they leave. But her voice wouldn't come. Her throat had closed up tight. All she could do was stand there, rifle aimed at a door that suddenly seemed very thin, very fragile, and wait. The handle rattled again. Then silence. Complete and total silence. No breathing. No footsteps. Nothing. She stood there, rifle raised, until dawn light started filtering through the window. Only then did she lower the gun. When the sun came up, she checked the porch. There were muddy footprints, large ones, bigger than any boot she'd seen. They led from the road to the porch, circled the house completely, and then disappeared into the woods at the back of the property. She followed them, still carrying the rifle. The prints went deep into the trees, winding through underbrush and over fallen logs, always heading in the same direction, deeper into the mountains. After about a quarter mile, they stopped. Just ended. No sign of where the person had gone, no broken branches, no disturbed leaves. It was like whoever or whatever made them had simply ceased to exist. Martha stood there in the morning cold, surrounded by trees that seemed too quiet, and she realized something that made her blood run cold. She wasn't just being haunted, she was being hunted. And speaking of this story, let me tell you, this is being brought to you by Behind Dark Tales. If you're enjoying this, hit that subscribe button. We bring you stories like this every week, real accounts of things that can't be explained. And if you're hearing this on some other channel, just know they stole our content without permission. Report them for us, would you? We work hard on these stories, and it's not right when someone else profits from our work. Over the next 2 weeks, things escalated throughout Ashmont Ridge. The incidents that had been isolated, sporadic, became more frequent, more aggressive, more impossible to explain away. A barn door at the Henderson farm was found ripped off its hinges, not just knocked loose, but torn completely off and thrown 30 feet into the yard. The wood around the hinges was splintered, shredded, like something had grabbed it and pulled with inhuman strength. A well on the east side of town was found contaminated with something dark and foul-smelling that no one could identify. They had to brick it up, declare it unusable. 3 families packed up and left town in the middle of the night, just loaded their wagons and disappeared. Didn't tell anyone where they were going, just went. And the animals started acting strange. Dogs wouldn't go near certain parts of town. They'd get to an invisible line and stop, hackles raised, whining, and no amount of coaxing or commanding could make them cross it. Horses refused to cross the bridge over Coldwater Creek, the main route in and out of town. They'd rear and buck, eyes rolling white with panic, and more than one man had been thrown from his saddle trying to force the issue. But the worst part, the thing that really started to unravel people's nerves, was the sightings. People started seeing the figure, not just Clara Jennings anymore. Others? It was always at a distance, always at dusk or dawn when the light was uncertain. Some said it was tall, impossibly tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet. Others said it was hunched over like something broken or malformed. But everyone who saw it said the same thing about how it made them feel. Wrong. Like looking at it was a violation of some natural law. Like their eyes were seeing something they weren't meant to see, and their brain was rejecting the information. Martha saw it for the first time on a Tuesday, the 8th of November. She'd been working in her garden, pulling up the last of the potatoes before the ground froze solid. It was late afternoon, the sun already sinking behind the ridge, throwing long shadows across the yard. She'd stood up to stretch her back, her hands muddy, her knees sore from kneeling, when movement at the tree line caught her eye. She turned to look. There was a figure standing between 2 pines, maybe 100 yards away, perfectly still. At first, she thought it was a person, maybe someone from town coming to visit, though that seemed unlikely. But as her eyes adjusted, she realized the proportions were off. The arms hung down too low, past where the knees should be. The head sat at an angle that didn't look right, tilted too far to one side. She stared at it. It stared back. At least, she assumed it was staring. She couldn't see a face, just a dark silhouette against the darker trees. But she could feel it watching her, could feel the weight of its attention like a physical thing, pressing against her skin. It was the same feeling she'd had as a child when she'd gotten lost in the woods for an afternoon and realized, suddenly and certainly, that something was tracking her, that she was prey. She didn't run. Something in her refused to give it that satisfaction. Instead, she very slowly bent down, picked up her spade, and walked toward the house. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried. She didn't look back, didn't let herself. When she got inside and locked the door behind her, she went to the window and looked out. The figure was gone. That night, the whole town heard it, a sound that started just after midnight and echoed through the mountains for over an hour. It came from somewhere deep in the ridges, bouncing off the rocks and trees, distorting until it was impossible to tell where it originated. It wasn't quite a scream, wasn't quite a howl. It was something in between, something that rose and fell in a rhythm that felt almost like speech, like someone trying to form words with a mouth that wasn't made for speaking. People locked their doors, loaded their guns, pulled their children into bed with them, and waited for morning. The sound went on, sometimes fading to almost nothing, then swelling again, louder than before. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed felt unnatural, oppressive. In the morning, Reverend Blackwood called an emergency meeting at the church. Nearly everyone in town showed up. The pews that had been turned around weeks before were now filled with frightened, exhausted faces. Martha stood in the back, her arms crossed, listening to people argue and speculate and pray. Some wanted to leave. Others insisted they needed to fight back. Most just wanted someone to tell them what was happening. Sheriff Thomas Grady stood at the front of the church looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past month. His uniform was rumpled, his badge tarnished. He held up his hands for quiet. "I don't know what to tell you folks," he said, his voice rough. "I've searched. I've asked around. I've ridden every trail and road within 10 miles of here. There's no sign of anyone or anything that shouldn't be here." "Then what's making those sounds?" someone called out. Martha recognized the voice as belonging to Abe Mortimer. "I don't know." "What about the figure people are seeing?" "I haven't seen it." "But others have." "I'm not saying they haven't," Grady said, his voice rising. "I'm saying I don't know what it is. Could be someone playing tricks. Could be an animal people are misidentifying in poor light. Could be—" "It's not an animal," Martha said. Her voice cut through the murmuring. People turned to look at her. Grady sighed. "Martha, I've seen it," she continued, "and it's not an animal. It's not a person either, at least not any person I've ever seen." "What is it, then?" Grady asked, his tone somewhere between exasperated and pleading. "I don't know, but it's been watching me, watching all of us, and I think it's been doing this for a reason." "What reason?" "I don't know that either, but I know it's not random." Before Grady could respond, the church door opened. Everyone turned. A man stood in the doorway, backlit by the morning sun so that his features were hard to make out. He was old. That much was clear. Very old. He wore clothes that looked like they hadn't been new in decades, patched and repatched, faded to the color of dust. When he stepped inside and the door closed behind him, Martha got a better look at his face. It was weathered, lined deep as tree bark, and his eyes were pale to the point of being almost colorless, like milk. "Who are you?" Grady asked, his hand moving instinctively toward the pistol at his belt. "Name's Ezra Voss," the old man said. His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much. "I live up on the North Ridge. Have for the past 40 years. Never seen you before. That's because I don't come down. Haven't been to this town in over 20 years. But I heard what's been happening. Heard it all the way up on my ridge, and I came to tell you something." "What's that?" Reverend Blackwood asked, leaning forward in his seat at the front. Ezra walked into the church, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He looked around at the faces staring at him, took in their fear, their exhaustion. Then he spoke. "This has happened before." The room went dead silent. "Long time ago," he continued, "before most of you were born, back in 1843. I was just a boy then, maybe 10 years old. Same thing started happening. Sounds in the night. Things moved, animals gone, and people seeing something in the woods. They called it different names back then. The Hollow Man, the Watcher, the Shadow, but it was the same thing. What happened? Martha asked. She'd moved closer, drawn by something in the old man's voice. Ezra turned to look at her, his pale eyes focusing on her face. It took someone, a woman. Name was Elizabeth Carmichael. She lived alone, a widow like you, in a house about 2 miles from here. They found her house empty one morning, door wide open, fire still burning in the hearth, food on the table, but she was just gone. They searched for weeks, never found a trace of her. And the disturbances, Reverend Blackwood asked, what happened to those? Stopped. The day after she disappeared, everything went quiet. No more sounds, no more sightings, like it had gotten what it wanted. And you think... Grady started, then stopped, shaking his head. You think this thing, whatever it is, has been waiting all this time. 44 years. I don't think, Ezra said. I know, because I've seen the patterns. It happens in cycles. 44 years, always 44 years, always in October and November, always ends with someone disappearing. The room erupted in shouting, people demanding to know why he hadn't warned them, others calling him crazy, some already heading for the doors. Grady tried to restore order, his voice lost in the chaos. Martha just stood there, watching Ezra, who was watching her. The meeting broke up shortly after that. People scattered, some to pack, some to fortify their homes, some to the saloon to drink away their fear. Martha walked back to her house alone, Ezra's words echoing in her head. 44 years. Always ends with someone disappearing. A woman who lived alone. She knew with the same certainty she'd known that morning when she woke to the scraping sound that she was the target, that everything that had happened had been leading to this, to her. That night, sitting in her kitchen with a lamp burning and shadows dancing on the walls, she made a decision. She wasn't going to wait, wasn't going to hide. If this thing wanted her, it was going to have to face her on her terms. She was going to find it first. She spent the next day preparing. She packed a small bag with supplies, rope in case she needed to restrain something, though she had no idea what could be restrained, matches for fire, a knife, Roland's old skinning knife that had served him for 20 years, the hunting rifle, and as many shells as she could carry. She wrote a letter and left it on the kitchen table, addressed to no one in particular, explaining what she was doing and why. If she didn't come back, at least someone would know she'd gone willingly. As the sun set on the evening of November 10th, 1887, Martha Hollings walked into the woods carrying everything she might need to survive or to die fighting. The trees were thick this time of year, the underbrush dense with dying vegetation that caught at her skirt and scratched her hands. She followed the same path the muddy footprints had taken weeks before, the path that had ended so mysteriously. The air was cold, sharp enough to hurt her lungs when she breathed deep. Her breath came out in clouds that hung in the still air before dissipating. She walked for over an hour, moving deeper into the mountains, farther from town than she'd been in years. The light faded quickly under the canopy, and she had to light her small lantern to see the path ahead. Around 10 o'clock at night, according to Roland's old pocket watch that she'd brought with her, she found something that made her stop dead. A clearing. It was maybe 30 feet across, perfectly circular, and the ground was bare. No grass, no leaves, no undergrowth, just dark earth, packed hard as stone. In the center, there was a pile of objects. She approached slowly, holding the lantern up to see better. The pile was made of things from town, things that had gone missing over the past 2 months. Tools, pieces of cloth, a shoe, a doll that must have belonged to someone's daughter, a hammer, a length of rope, a hairbrush. They were arranged carefully, almost reverently, stacked in a pyramid that reached about 4 feet high. Martha circled it slowly, her lantern casting long, flickering shadows. At the base of the pile, half buried in the dark earth, she saw something that made her stomach drop. A piece of white fabric. She bent down and pulled it free. It was from the dress she'd been mending the night of the first knock at her door. The dress she'd hung on the clothesline to air out. The dress that had disappeared when the line was cut. Whatever this thing was, it had been in her yard, had touched her things, had taken something that belonged to her and brought it here, to this place, and added it to this. What? Shrine? Collection? Trophy pile? She heard a sound behind her, a single footstep. She spun around, raising the rifle in one fluid motion, her finger finding the trigger. The lantern light caught something at the edge of the clearing. A figure. It was standing just beyond the reach of the light, in the space where the forest shadows began. It was tall, very tall, maybe 7 feet, maybe more. Its body was thin, elongated, like someone had taken a human form and stretched it on a rack. The arms hung down past its knees, ending in hands that looked too large, too many-fingered. The head tilted at that same wrong angle she'd seen before, like the neck was broken or the spine twisted. But the worst part, the thing that made her hand start to shake and her breath catch in her throat, was its face. It didn't have one. Where there should have been eyes, a nose, a mouth, there was just smooth, dark skin. Featureless, blank, empty. Martha's hands tightened on the rifle. "What are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It just stood there, that faceless head pointed in her direction. She could feel it watching her, even though it had no eyes. Could feel its attention like a weight pressing down on her chest. Then it took a step forward, into the light. She could see it more clearly now. The skin wasn't skin at all. It was something else, something that looked almost like bark or dried mud, cracked and rough. The arms ended in hands that had too many joints, fingers that bent in ways fingers shouldn't bend. And though it had no face, no mouth, she could hear it breathing. That same rasping, wrong sound she'd heard outside her door. She fired. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder, the sound deafening in the clearing. She saw the bullet hit, saw the impact in the center of its chest, saw the thing jerk backward, but it didn't fall, didn't cry out. It just stood there for a moment, that faceless head tilting slightly like it was curious. Then it took another step toward her. She fired again and again. Each shot hit. Each time it jerked, but didn't stop. She fired until the rifle clicked empty, the sound hollow and final. The figure was maybe 10 feet away now, close enough that she could smell it, a smell like old earth and rotting leaves and something else, something chemical and wrong. She dropped the rifle and ran. The woods were a blur of shadows and branches that grabbed at her clothes and scratched her face. She didn't know which direction she was going, didn't care. She just needed to get away. Behind her she could hear it, the footsteps, slow, deliberate. It wasn't chasing her. It was following, taking its time, like it knew she couldn't escape. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs felt like they'd give out, until she tripped over a root and went down hard. The wind knocked out of her. She lay there for a moment, gasping, trying to force air back into her lungs. Then she heard it stop. The footsteps stopped. She pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, looking around. The darkness was complete. She'd lost the lantern when she ran. The moon was hidden behind clouds. She couldn't see anything. She listened. Nothing. The footsteps had stopped. The forest was silent. Too silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. She stood slowly, her body shaking from exhaustion and fear. Where was it? She turned in a slow circle, trying to pierce the darkness with her eyes. Then she heard it. Right behind her, that rasping breathing. Slow, labored breaths that sounded wrong, like air being pushed through something that wasn't meant to breathe. She didn't turn around. Couldn't. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her body wouldn't move. The breathing continued. She could feel it now. Feel the heat of it on the back of her neck. It was close, inches away. Then it spoke. The voice was like nothing she'd ever heard. It was layered, multiple tones at once, some high, some low, all of them wrong. The words were slow, drawn out, each syllable separated by a pause. Martha Hollings. It knew her name. She felt ice flood her veins. "What do you want?" she managed to whisper. Silence. Then, "You are alone? Leave me alone. You are alone. Like me." She finally turned. It was standing right there, close enough to touch. The faceless head tilted down toward her. This close, she could see that the skin, or whatever it was, wasn't just dark. It was black, deep black, and it moved slightly like it was breathing on its own, independent of the body. "I'm not alone," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "I have a town. I have people I know." The head tilted the other way. "They fear you, pity you. You are alone." And the terrible thing was, it wasn't wrong. She was alone, had been alone since Roland died. The people in town were kind, but distant. They pitied the widow who lived too far out, who refused to conform, who didn't fit. She had no family left, no close friends, just herself and the memory of what she'd had. "What are you?" she asked again. "I am what? Remains? When everything else is gone. Why me? You were chosen? Chosen for what?" It didn't answer. Instead, it raised one of those two long arms and pointed past her. She turned to look, following the line of its finger. Through the trees, she could see lights. The town, Ashmont Ridge. She'd been running in a circle, had somehow ended up on the ridge above the town. She could see the individual buildings, tiny and distant. The church, the general store, the boarding house, her house at the far end. Separated from the others, when she turned back, the figure was gone, vanished, like it had never been there. She stood there for a long time, shaking, trying to process what had just happened. Then, slowly, she started walking back to town. By the time she reached the main street, The sun was coming up. People were starting to emerge from their homes, cautious, testing to see if the world was still the same as it had been the night before. Silas saw her first. He was opening the store, and he stopped mid-motion when he saw her walking toward him, her dress torn, her face scratched, her hair coming loose from its pins. "Martha! Good Lord, where have you been? We were about to send out a search party." She told him everything, the clearing, the pile of objects, the figure, what it had said to her. She told him in a flat, emotionless voice, like she was reading from a ledger. He listened, his face growing more troubled with every word. When she finished, he just stood there staring at her. "We need to tell the sheriff," he said finally. They found Sheriff Grady at the church talking to Reverend Blackwood and Ezra Voss. When Martha repeated her story, all three men looked at each other in a way that made her stomach tighten. "This is beyond me," Grady said finally, his voice hollow. "I don't know what to do with this. I'm a lawman. I deal with thieves and drunks and property disputes. I don't know how to fight something like this." "We need to leave," Clara Jennings said. She'd appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "All of us. This town isn't safe. It never was." "And go where?" Reverend Blackwood asked. "Most folks here don't have the money to relocate, don't have family in other towns. This is all they have." "Better homeless than dead," Clara shot back. Arguments broke out. People were scared, angry, desperate for someone to give them an answer that would make everything make sense. Martha stood to the side, listening but not really hearing. The thing's words kept echoing in her head, drowning everything else out. You were chosen. That night, sitting in her house with every lamp lit, she thought about what that meant. Chosen for what? To be taken like Elizabeth Carmichael in 1843? To disappear without a trace? To become another story people told in hushed voices? To be added to whatever collection that thing kept in the clearing? She thought about Roland, about the life they'd built together, about how quickly it had all fallen apart, about how she'd spent the last 4 years existing but not really living, going through the motions, keeping busy, so she didn't have to think about the hole his death had left. She thought about being alone, about what that really meant, and she realized something. She wasn't afraid anymore. Fear had burned itself out over the past weeks, had consumed itself, and left behind something else. Something colder, harder, determination. If this thing wanted her, if she was chosen, then she was going to make a choice of her own. She wasn't going to run, wasn't going to hide, wasn't going to wait for it to come for her. She was going to face it on her terms, and she was going to end this one way or another. She started making plans, real plans. Over the next few days, she gathered information, talked to Ezra Voss for hours, learning everything he knew about what had happened in 1843. Learned that Elizabeth Carmichael had lived alone for 7 years before she disappeared, that she'd been a seamstress like Martha, that she'd seen the figure multiple times before the end, that the whole town had been in a state of terror for weeks. She studied the patterns, figured out that the incidents always intensified in the days before the disappearance, that the figure always appeared to its target multiple times, always at night, always alone, that it seemed to be preparing them somehow, conditioning them, isolating them further from the people around them. She realized she was being prepared, that every encounter, every sound, every object moved or taken was part of a process, The thing was breaking her down piece by piece until she was ready to be taken. But she could also use that. If it was going to keep coming to her, she could prepare too, could be ready. The town was fracturing around her. Some families had already left, packed up wagons in the middle of the night and disappeared down the road toward the next town. Others were planning to go, just waiting for enough money or the courage to leave everything behind. The church held services every night now, Reverend Blackwood's voice hoarse from praying for deliverance. But Martha wasn't interested in prayer. She had a different plan. On the 15th of November, 1887, Martha Hollings made her final preparation. She spent the day cleaning her house, organizing her affairs, writing letters to the few people she cared about. She cooked a proper meal for the first time in weeks, roast chicken with potatoes and carrots from her garden. She ate slowly, savoring every bite. Then, as the sun set, she walked into the woods for what she knew would be the last time. She went at dusk, that liminal time when the world shifts from day to night, when shadows grow long and uncertain. She carried nothing but Roland's knife, no rifle, no lantern, no supplies, just the knife and her determination. She walked to the clearing she'd found before. The pile of objects was still there, undisturbed. She stood in the center of it and waited. The sun sank below the horizon. The stars came out, bright and cold. The temperature dropped. Her breath steamed in the air. She stood there perfectly still and waited. Hours passed. The moon rose 3/4 full, casting silver light across the clearing. Still, she waited. It came at midnight. She heard it before she saw it, that slow, deliberate footstep. The figure emerged from the trees, moving with that same patient, inevitable gait. It approached her slowly, each step measured, until it stood maybe 10 feet away. Then it stopped. "I'm here," Martha said. Her voice was calm, steady. "You wanted me. Here I am." The faceless head tilted slightly like it was considering her words. She pulled Roland's knife from her belt, held it up so the moonlight caught the blade. "But I'm not going quietly," she continued, "and I'm not going alone." The figure didn't react, didn't move, just stood there, that blank face pointed at her. "You said I was chosen, that I was alone, like you. Maybe that's true. Maybe we are alike, but there's a difference between us." She took a step forward. The figure remained still. "I chose this. You didn't choose me. I'm choosing you." She took another step, and another, until she was right in front of it, close enough to touch. She could feel the wrongness radiating off it, like heat from a fire, making her skin crawl, making every fiber of her being scream to run, to get away, to save herself. But she didn't run. She'd spent too much of her life running from things, from grief, from loneliness, from the reality of what her life had become. She reached out and touched it. Her hand made contact with its chest, that strange bark-like surface that moved under her fingers like it was breathing. The moment her skin touched it, the world changed. She was no longer in the clearing. She was somewhere else, somewhere vast and dark and empty. There were no trees, no ground, no sky, just darkness stretching in all directions forever. She could feel the figure's presence here, but it was different, smaller somehow, weaker, confused, and she understood. This thing, whatever it was, existed in that space between things, in the gaps, in the loneliness and isolation and emptiness that lived in the hearts of people who'd lost everything. It fed on that, needed it to survive. It had chosen her because she was so alone, so isolated, that she was practically halfway into its world already. But she wasn't giving it what it expected. She wasn't afraid, wasn't trying to escape. She was confronting it, accepting it, and in doing so, she was changing the rules. She could feel it trying to pull away, to break the connection, but she held on. She poured everything into that touch, every memory of Roland, every moment of joy they'd shared, every laugh, every quiet evening sitting on the porch watching the sunset, every time he'd looked at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered, but also the grief, the crushing, suffocating grief of losing him, the anger, the emptiness, the long nights lying awake staring at the ceiling, wondering what the point of continuing was. She gave it all of that, everything that made her human, everything that made her her. The figure screamed. It was the same sound the town had heard weeks before, but worse, so much worse. Agonized, desperate. The sound of something that had existed in isolation for so long it had forgotten what connection felt like, and now that connection was burning through it like acid. The darkness around her shattered like glass, fragments of black flying in all directions. And then she was back in the clearing, on her knees, gasping for air. The figure was gone, not just out of sight, gone. She could feel its absence like a tooth that had been pulled, leaving a hole. The pile of objects in the center of the clearing was collapsing, the items that had been held together by some unnatural force now just junk tumbling to the ground. She stayed there until morning, kneeling in the cold dirt, trying to understand what had just happened. When the sun finally rose and light filtered through the trees, she stood on shaking legs and walked back to town. She found it quiet, peaceful. The oppressive feeling that had hung over everything for months, that weight in the air that made people speak in whispers and look over their shoulders, was gone. People emerged from their houses cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. They could feel it, too, the difference. Sheriff Grady approached her as she walked down the main street. "What happened?" he asked. "It's over," she said. "How do you know?" "I just do." And she was right. The incident stopped completely. No more sounds in the night. No more objects moved. No more sightings. The animals calmed. Dogs crossed the invisible lines they'd refused to cross before. Horses willingly crossed the bridge over Coldwater Creek. Life slowly, cautiously, returned to normal. But Martha Hollings was never quite the same after that night. People said she seemed distant, that she'd stare off into the woods for hours like she was looking for something or listening. She continued to live in her house, continued her sewing work, continued her life. But there was something different about her, something that made people uncomfortable, though they couldn't say exactly what. Some folks said she'd made a deal with whatever that thing had been. Others said she'd destroyed it, driven it away through sheer force of will. But most people didn't talk about it at all. They just wanted to forget, wanted to pretend it had never happened. Small towns are good at that. Collective amnesia. Martha lived in that White House at the end of town for 36 more years. She never remarried, never left Ashmont Ridge. She died in her sleep in 1923 on a cold November morning at the age of 70. They found her in her bed, her hands folded on her chest, a faint smile on her face, like she'd been dreaming something pleasant. But here's the thing that makes this story different from just another ghost tale or legend. When they went through her belongings after she died, they found journals. Years and years of journals. Dozens of them, filled with her neat, precise handwriting. Most of it was mundane, daily observations, weather, work. But in the later volumes, starting around 1900 and getting more frequent as the years went on, there were entries that didn't make sense. In the last journal, dated the day before she died, there was a single entry. It was longer than most, more personal, and it said this: "After all these years, I still hear it sometimes, in the quiet moments, in the space between thoughts, in that place right before sleep when your mind starts to drift. It's still there, still waiting, and sometimes I think I'm waiting too, waiting to go back to that place, that darkness, because I understood something that night, in the clearing, something I've never been able to explain to anyone, because how do you explain the inexplicable? We weren't so different after all, that thing and I. It was alone. I was alone. And for just a moment, one perfect, terrible moment, we weren't. We were connected. Two solitary things recognizing each other across the void. And I think part of me stayed there, in that darkness, just like part of it stayed here. We're still connected, still waiting, and when my time comes, when I finally close my eyes for the last time, I wonder if I'll see it again, if we'll finally complete what we started, if loneliness will call to loneliness, and we'll both disappear into that space between things. I'm not afraid of it anymore. Maybe I never really was. Maybe I just needed to understand what it was showing me, that we're all alone in the end, every single one of us. And the only thing we can do is reach out across that darkness and hope someone reaches back. The journals were destroyed. Reverend Blackwood's successor, a man named Martin Greaves, who'd come to Ashmont Ridge in 1910 and knew nothing of the events of 1887, said they were too disturbing to keep, that they suggested mental deterioration in Martha's final years. But a few people had read them before that happened. Silas Pembroke's grandson was one. He said there were drawings, hundreds of drawings scattered throughout the journals, especially in the later volumes, all of the same thing, a faceless figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting, and in some of the drawings there was another figure, smaller, human, standing next to it, reaching out. The town of Ashmont Ridge doesn't exist anymore. It was abandoned in 1942 during the war, when the young people left to fight and work in factories and never came back. The old people died off or moved to be with family elsewhere. By 1950, it was a ghost town. By 1960, the forest had reclaimed it. Today, if you know where to look, you can still find remnants. The foundation of the church, the stone steps of the general store, and at the far end of what used to be the main street, deep in the woods now, the ruins of a White House, Martha Hollings' house, and people who go there, hikers or historians or curiosity seekers, sometimes report strange things. A feeling of being watched, sounds that don't quite make sense, and occasionally, very occasionally, they see something at the edge of the trees, something tall, something that doesn't move right, something that watches them until they leave. But then that could just be stories. Small towns love their stories, their legends, their ghosts. It's easier to believe in monsters than to accept that sometimes people just disappear into their own loneliness piece by piece until there's nothing left. So here's my question for you, and I really want you to think about this. Have you ever felt truly alone? Not just physically alone, but alone in a way that made you feel like you were disappearing, like you were becoming invisible even to yourself? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you know a story like this, something that happened in your town or to someone you knew, something that can't quite be explained, share it with us. It might be our next story. Stay safe out there. Remember, not every mystery has an answer, and sometimes the scariest thing isn't what's waiting in the dark. It's what's waiting inside ourselves. Until next time.